Alright everyone, we're here. It's the most important video of the year. My top 10 favorite books of 2023. Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. It is the end of 2023, so of course I needed to film my top 10 books of the year. As always, like previous years, this video is my list of favorites from the books that I read personally in this year. So it's not the books that came out this year that are my favorite, it's the books that I read in 2023 that are part of my top 10. Now every year it's a struggle to pick my top 10 favorite books of the year, but this year was a little bit harder than usual, and I think that's because I read a lot of different books than I usually do. I read more adult, I read more memoirs, I read more nonfiction. I also had a pretty difficult year mental health wise, so my reading just took different dives and dips throughout the year. But through it all, I think, as with every year, reading is always my solace. It's the place that I return to. It is the one thing I can count on to give me comfort and joy in times when I am not doing so well. And it's also a place where I find I can understand myself a little bit better through the lens of the characters and the people that I'm reading about. So as you'll see with my top 10 list, a lot of the books are a bit different from what I've usually picked, and some of them directly related to what I was going through this year. Now, of course, I couldn't just limit myself to 10 books. I have several honorable mentions to tell you about today. These are all great books that I also think could have made it on my top 10 list had like one of the other books not existed or had I not read one of them. And these are also just really great books that I think all of you should pick up. So these honorable mentions are in no particular order, but I'm going to start with the most recent one that I have, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and this is by Heather Fawcett. This book was just such a cozy fantasy read, and it's just something that will definitely give you a pick-me-up feeling. I literally read this a week ago and fell absolutely in love with it. The characters in the world and the story are just so utterly charming, and I think you can't walk away from this book without a huge smile on your face. Emily Wilde is our main character, who is this like curmudgeonly professor who is studying fairies and is building this encyclopedia of fairies. And so she finds herself in this like remote town in England trying to study the specific species of fairies called the hidden fae that no one really knows too much about, and she wants to include a chapter about them in her encyclopedia. So she has to engage with the small town folk, and she is visited by one of her colleagues who she thinks may be a fairy himself. This is one of those fantasy books that has so many lovely magical elements to it, but is totally low stakes. It's just a fun, cozy read, and I honestly found myself falling in love with Emily Wilde as a character and just the romance that happens as well. And overall, I just enjoyed it so much. This was definitely a really nice surprise at the end of the year, and I'm so glad I picked it up. The next honorable mention that I have is Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan. This is one of the most incredible romances I've ever read. This follows a divorced couple who own a restaurant together and have several kids together who end up finding themselves sort of rekindling their romance in a way. And this is definitely like a second chance romance, but I think the way that this book was done was just so incredible. It deals with so many other themes aside from the romance, and it made for a really romantic but also heartbreaking novel. I love the relationship between the characters and the care that they had for each other, but I also love seeing like the growth that their relationship goes through. They start at a very different place than where they end up, and it's also just a novel about healing. Yasmin and Josiah have gone through so much prior to the book even starting, so they're finding a way to heal themselves so that they can be together. Alright, the next honorable mention is one that I definitely think everyone should pick up, and that is Another Now by Yanis Varoufakis. This is a science fiction novel that is so much more than the science fiction element. It essentially talks about capitalism and our economy in a fictional sense that really pulls apart all the things that's wrong with our society right now. The premise of this book essentially follows a disillusioned computer engineer who basically creates this revolutionary technology that allows us to see into another now of our world. So another version of our world had something happened differently. And the specific another now that they're looking into is one where after the Wall Street collapse in 2008, people had decided to create a more fair and just society rid of capitalism. So we're seeing our characters in our current world, but also in the another now. And the characters end up interacting with their other selves. And it's honestly just so interesting the way that this book was imagined. And although we have this like fictional plot line and situation going on. I think the main point of the book is really to talk about capitalism in our world as it is now and how it is flawed, but also how it's very, very difficult to completely get rid of capitalism without fixing a lot of other issues in our society. This is definitely a book that will leave you thinking for a long time afterwards, so I highly, highly recommend it. All right, the next honorable mention that I have is Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. I absolutely loved Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, the first book in this series, and this is the sequel to Ninth House, and it came out earlier this year and I absolutely fell in love with it. I think this book, in comparison to Ninth House, was a little bit easier to get into from the get-go, but I have to say that I did reread Ninth House at the end of last year, so that did also help refresh things in my memory before I started this one. But overall, this book sort of expands on the world of Ninth House. We get to know more about some of the side characters, and I really enjoyed that element and sort of the found family aspect that we started to get more of in this book. But I think the thing that really made this book for me was just the evolutions in the relationship between Darlington and Alex Stern. It's the will they won't they romance in the series, which is like barely even a major part to the story, but it's just so significant in my brain, and I honestly just loved getting more moments with the both of them in this book. So yeah, I'm really excited to see what's gonna happen in the next books in the series. I absolutely love everything that Leigh Bardugo writes, so I am not at all surprised that I love this. All right, and then the final honorable mention that I have today is one that I actually expected to be on my top 10 list, but I think I've just read so many great books this year that this one is gonna be an honorable mention instead. So that is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I know a lot of people love this one. I personally love R.F. Kuang as an author so much. She's written so many great books, including the Poppy War series and Babel. But I do think this one, while it was super entertaining, it wasn't like my favorite out of her books, just because Babel and the Poppy War with the fantasy element have so much more gravity to them. Because although this one is set in the real world and goes over all of the pitfalls of publishing, I do think that it felt a little bit thinner than Babel or the Poppy War. It is meant to be that way though. It is a satirical novel. It's a really fast-paced novel and one that you can definitely devour in like a day. And overall it was just like really thrilling and thought-provoking, and I remember just flipping pages so quickly because I wanted to know what happened at the end. If you're looking for sort of a satirical thriller with a really awful main character that you're sort of supposed to step back and examine, then this is definitely the book to pick up. Alrighty, with that said, let's get into my top 10 books of 2023. I did order these a little bit, but I wouldn't give too much credence to the ranking because my thoughts on books tend to change a lot. So this is how I feel currently, but maybe in a few months I'll be like, no, this one felt more significant than the other. I would also like to put the caveat here that although this is like my top 10, I do feel like, again, my opinions on things change often. There are previous top 10 lists that I've done before where if I look back on them now, I'm like, oh, why did I even include that in the top 10? So I'm sure that can definitely happen with this list too, but these are just some books that I enjoyed in 2023. So at number 10, I have The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Those of you who have been following my channel for a while now, you know Silvia Moreno-Garcia is one of my favorite authors ever. Everything she writes is almost gold. There's only like one book that I really did not like from her. And this one I had heard so many mixed opinions on, and I can see why people had mixed opinions about it, but I personally loved this book. It was just so heartfelt, and I had so much love for the main characters, Carlotta and Montgomery, and it's really a book about just discovering your own humanity, and I love that about it. The romance in this one was definitely one of my more favorite Silvia Moreno-Garcia romances. It felt more integral to the storyline, but it also had more of a bittersweet element to it, which I really loved. Essentially, this is a retelling of the story The Island of Dr. Moreau, and our main character Carlotta is the daughter of Dr. Moreau, and this is set in 19th century Mexico, and Dr. Moreau has a really wealthy patron who wants him to create laborers, so Dr. Moreau creates these hybrids that help with the labor on the peninsula, but things sort of turn on their head when the son of the patron arrives on the island and starts asking questions and maybe looking for a bride, and things sort of develop from there. Dr. Moreau has a sort of helper named Montgomery, who's an Englishman who has gone through a lot of stuff in his life and is sort of passing his time here, and Carlotta has a lot of questions about the hybrids and just the way things are. She's been very protected by her father, and a lot of these questions start to find some answers as the book unfolds. Again, what I loved about this book was just the heart of the characters and how innocent and naive they start off and how much they learn by the end. I don't think any of the characters in this book are perfect. they're all very flawed characters, which is something I just personally enjoy in books. So yeah, I really love this book. I think about it all the time, and Montgomery and Carlotta have my whole heart. All right, at number 9, I have a book that I never expected to put on my top 10 list, and even after I had read it, or even while I was reading it, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this, but by the end I really did enjoy it, but I still didn't think it was a top 10. And then as I was sort of building this list and thinking about all of the themes and all of the books that I'd read this year, this one just really stood out in my memory. I did read it very recently, so that might be why, but I still feel like it blended together so many themes that I love. So that book is Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. I read this for a vlog where I read the Goodreads horror nominees for the year. Basically, this book follows our main character who used to be a piano prodigy. She went to this conservatory. She's the daughter of these Chinese immigrants who fled China after the Cultural Revolution, and she grew up with not much. She grew up trying to help her parents out, but when we meet her, she has sort of aged out of her prodigy talents, and she's gone through a bit of stuff, including some things that happened to her parents, and she's working at like a fast food restaurant when she's approached by this woman who invites her to come work at this natural beauty company called Holistic. And so our main character, along with the other girls at Holistic, are selling these beauty products, but are also told to take some of these beauty products home and use them themselves and make sure that they're keeping care of their bodies and their beauty so that they show the most inviting face to their customers. Now that's the premise, but I feel like this book is just something you need to experience. It's sort of surreal and dreamlike, but it's also a bit of a thriller, I would say, because as you get further into the book, you really want to know what's actually going on. And I do feel like the horror elements of this book were just so fantastic. There's a lot of body horror that happens, especially in like the last half of the book. And there's also a little bit of queer representation, but also lots of discussions of beauty, of youth, and the expectations that are put on women and their bodies and their beauty. Not only that, this is also a story about like family and the sacrifices that we make for family. And I think that was one of the elements that just really hit me really hard. I personally related to a lot of the things that the main character was going through. And so overall, the book, although it was a bit of a slow to start and like uncomfortable read at some parts, it just stuck with me so much. And I think it tackled so many of the themes so well while also being really thrilling by the end. As with most books on this list, I know this book won't be for everyone, but I personally really loved it. All right, next up I have a book that, again, I did not expect to have on this top 10 list, but I read it recently and absolutely fell in love with it, and I just can't not include it on this video. And that book is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. So this book, like some of the other books on this list, isn't like a perfect 5 stars for me, but it was still such an amazing book and still one that I think is in my top 10 for the year. It's definitely one of my favorites from here on out because I enjoyed reading it so much. This is a book that's been popular on Book Talk for ages now. It was originally self-published and was later picked up by a traditional publisher. And I have to say, I went into this with such low expectations, but I was just so pleasantly surprised by the end. Essentially, this book follows Constanta, who is one of Dracula's brides, and the book is told from her perspective through this like very long letter that she's writing to Dracula. So the entire book is written in the second person and she addresses Dracula directly, you, but throughout the book she keeps Dracula unnamed, and so in some ways it just feels like such a personal love letter and story. There were several things that I absolutely loved about this book, one of them being the way that it takes us through history. Over the course of the book we go through several centuries and we are following our characters through the ups and downs of their relationship, but also through their own personal journeys with the idea of having this immortal life. This book also has a polyamorous relationship, so there's multiple other characters who come in much later, and I loved seeing the relationship dynamics between all of them. This is seductive and lyrical, has queer representation, but is also just deeply heartbreaking and also romantic. One thing I really loved about this book was the way it took this idea of Dracula and Constanta being his bride and using it as a metaphor for the idea of a toxic relationship. I think it was done super well. I read the entire book in about a day and I was just so compelled and entranced by the story, and I wanted to know what was going to happen by the end. So if you're looking for a thrilling, seductive, gothic, horrific book, then this is definitely one to pick up. All right, at number 7, we have another book that completely took me by surprise and I read quite recently, and that is Finlay Donovan is Killing It by Elle Cosimano. I had been hearing about this book for ages, and when I finally picked it up, I had such low expectations that when I actually started to enjoy it, I was just so blown away. This is one of the most coziest mysteries I've ever read, but it's also just so goddamn funny. We basically follow our main character, Finlay Donovan, who is a mom of 2 children. children. She's recently divorced, and she's also a writer, and she's just struggling to juggle all of the things. But when this woman overhears her and her agent talking about her murder mystery novels, that woman ends up thinking Finlay Donovan is a contract killer and attempts to hire Finlay to kill her husband. From there, the book just sort of spirals in so many directions, and there are so many thrilling and funny moments where Finlay Donovan just digs herself deeper into this mess. And it was just so fun following her and also her babysitter Veronica as they just get into these various hijinks, trying to solve a mystery and hide a dead body and all of the other things. I think the reason why I enjoyed this so much and why I want to include it on this video was because it was just so thoroughly something that I wouldn't regularly pick up, and so I was just taken by surprise and just fell so deeply in love with these characters. This is part of a series, so there's like 2 other books that are out and a 4th one that's also coming out, and I've already read the other 2 sequels and absolutely love them as well, so this is definitely like a new favorite series for me, which is rare for like a mystery series for me. So yeah, if you're looking for a really fun and cozy mystery, then this is definitely one to pick up. Alright, the next book that I have is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This book is a part memoir, part narrative, where the author examines the abusive and volatile relationship that she had with her same-sex partner. The book is told in 2 different voices, one where the author addresses herself from the past when she was in this toxic relationship, but then there's another form of storytelling in this book where the author sort of takes this essayist and analytical look into representations of psychological abuse, of abusive relationships in general, and of queer relationships as well. Reading this book just felt like I was holding in an astonished breath. Every line was just so beautiful or packed such a punch, and even though this is such a short book, I read it in like a few hours, I was just so blown away by the entire thing, and to this day it just sticks in my memory as such an incredible book. I think this is one of those books that just really destroys your concept of a genre and what a memoir is supposed to be, and I just love the way that I felt so strongly for our author and everything that they went through. I love the way that they connected their own personal struggles and things that they had gone through with a wider framework and a wider sense of what queer people go through and what people in abusive relationships go through. This was definitely a surprise, but I was just sobbing by the end of it, and I knew it was going to be a favorite for the year the moment I finished it. So if you're looking for a heart-wrenching memoir slash not a memoir, then this is definitely one to pick up. Alright, the next book that I have is also another memoir, and that is What My Bones Know, A Memory of Healing from Complex Trauma by Stephanie Fu. This is a book that I picked up after watching a video by Cindy from With Cindy, and she was talking about how she so deeply related to the author, and I was just so intrigued, so I wanted to pick it up. And when I did, I was so blown away by the journey of healing that the author goes through. This is a book about generational trauma, about mental illness, and how you can have everything seem perfect on paper and to the world, but on the inside you could be deeply struggling. So Stephanie Fu, at the age of 30, seemed super successful. She was a producer, she had a loving boyfriend, but behind closed doors she was having panic attacks and sobbing at her desk every morning. And after years of questioning what's wrong with herself, she finally stumbles on this diagnosis of complex PTSD. And so the book is told in different sections. We hear about her childhood at the beginning and the abuse that she suffered as a child, and we also find her many years later as she's trying to figure out her mental illness and when she gets this diagnosis of complex PTSD. And we also follow her as she's trying to get treatment for complex PTSD, which is actually very, very hard. And she talks about the several different doctors that she went to, psychologists, different treatments that she went through, and all the obstacles that she faced along the way. I think the thing that I loved the most about this book was the way that it connected mental illness to generational trauma, to our physical bodies, and to how our cultural landscape can also affect our state of mind. This was such a fascinating read from front to back, and as someone with a mental illness, this was just so heartbreaking and also heartwarming to read. Now, on that note, the next 2 favorites that I have are also memoirs and also ones that deal with mental illness, specifically bipolar disorder, which earlier this year I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder 2, and it drastically changed my life, and I'm so happy that I have this diagnosis now and that I know my mind better and that I'm now on the treatment and medication that I need. But these 2 books really helped me through this period of trying to get a diagnosis and then getting the diagnosis and then going through treatment and trying to understand my mind and all the hours of therapy that I went through this year. So those 2 books are Haldol and Hyacinths, A Bipolar Life by Melody Mosey, and then An Unquiet Mind, A Memoir of Moods and Madness by Kay Redfield Jamison. These are 2 books by 2 very different women from very different walks of life, and both are written in very different time periods as well. But the common thread between both of them is that they both are memoirs about a bipolar life. I cannot stress how important these books were for me and how they really helped me through one of the hardest periods of my life. An Unquiet Mind is a very short book. It's one you can read in a few hours, and it follows our author, Kay Redfield Jamison, from when she's very young into her adulthood through so many periods in her life and the various episodes of her bipolar disorder. It goes through her periods of psychosis and hospitalization and all of the signs that she missed growing up that so obviously indicated that she had bipolar disorder. The really incredible and unique thing about this memoir is that Kay Redfield Jamison is a professor and foremost authority on manic depression, manic depressive illness, or what is now known as bipolar disorder. And there's an element of her talking about her treating other mentally ill patients and how she wasn't able to see her own illness in herself because she kept denying it, because part of what bipolar disorder does is convince us that we are, not ill. And she talks a lot about the importance of medication and therapy and the various treatments to help us get to a stable point. I think what was so incredible about this book was that I was listening to Kay Redfield Jamison's words through the audiobook and was relating so hard to everything that she said. I finally saw like my own brain represented in a book completely, like my life represented in a book, and it was just such an incredible experience. Halda on Hyacinth is very similar. I felt so seen by this book, but this one also dealt with the author's identity as an Iranian American and her thoughts on the politics, but also her thoughts on having this sort of bipolar identity, not only in her actions and her mental state, but also in her cultural identity and how she was both Iranian and American. This book definitely goes into more detail about bipolar disorder and goes through the author's various hospitalizations as well. And I think what I loved about this memoir in particular was just the way that Melody Mosey was so honest about everything that she went through and all of the awful things that she did along the way, the awful things that her illness made her do. And I think that honesty was just really wonderful to see and definitely gave me comfort along the way. So yeah, this was definitely very, very impactful along with An Unquiet Mind. I know these two books won't be very relatable for many of you, but for those of you who are bipolar babes like me, I hope you are doing okay. I hope that you remember that you are loved and that you matter and that you are doing okay and that we are making it through together. Now, with that said, the last two books on this list, my top two favorites, I think really reflect a lot of what I was going through this year, but also just my personal taste with books and how I really love certain books because of my own personal relation to them and how I feel seen in them, but also how I see the world reflected in them. So at number 2 of my top 10 books of 2023, I have Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Mallories. So this is a very polarizing book, and if you go check on Goodreads, it has a mediocre rating, but this book was one that I read over the course of a few weeks while I was on vacation, and it just hit me so deep in my soul. And I think the reason for that is because the representation of mental illness in this book was just so stunning. Like, it was done so well, and I think that is the element that I connected to the most, and I have never seen mental illness so truthfully represented, in my opinion. Essentially, this book follows our main characters, Cleo and Frank, or Cleopatra and Frankenstein, and they have this sort of fateful meeting on New Year's Eve in New York, and they sort of hit things off. Both of them are sort of lonely souls in New York City, and we meet them many months later when they are getting married to help Cleo stay in the country because her student visa is expiring. She's originally from England, and from there we watch their marriage unfold over several months, I think the next year. And also we are following several characters that sort of surround these two people. So their friends, their family, and the different struggles that they are going through while living in New York. The one thing I want to warn you about this book is that it is a book full of completely flawed characters. Every single character in this book has some shit going on, is suffering from something, and is just trying their best. And I think what you need to understand is that none of them are particularly like the best people. They are making a lot of mistakes, they are doing awful things at some points, but they're also all struggling in very similar ways. None of these characters are particularly ones that I would root for, but the way that they are represented on the page is just so real and just raw, and I loved every moment of following these characters. They're all very dramatic. Like, there's some element of that drama and seeing that unfold on the page that is really fun. But I think seeing the different relationships and how each character saw each other differently, that was also just so stunning. I feel like the author had such a grasp of how these different characters interconnected and how their visions of each other was so different, and that made for such a layered and complex read that I really, really loved. This definitely has a lot of triggers, so I would be aware of that. There's a lot of other books on this list that have a lot of triggers, so search up content warnings across the board, but this one particularly has like a few difficult scenes. But I think as someone who is bipolar and who has suffered through some very dark depressions, this book just made me feel so seen in so many ways, and the representation of mental illness and of addiction in this book was just so incredible. Now, on a very similar note, my favorite book of the year, my top book of 2023 is Big Swiss by Jen-nuh-nee. If you guys told me at the beginning of the year that this would be my favorite book of the year, like, I would not have believed you. But this book, my God, took me for a ride, but also just hit me deep down in my soul in a way that I did not expect. Like, I felt called out by this book. It felt just so personal to me, and I fell in love with our main character and all the things that she goes through. So our main character, Greta, is this middle-aged woman who finds herself sort of leaving her perfect life and going to live with a friend named Sabine in this like old farmhouse in New York. And it's this like awful rundown house, and Greta spends her days working as a transcriber for this sex therapist. So day in and day out, she's listening to these therapy sessions and transcribing them for the sex therapist because he wants to write like some kind of novel or something. And she finds herself falling for one of the clients, and she gives her the nickname Big Swiss, and she finds herself just so enraptured by this woman. And from there, the story sort of unfolds as Greta finds herself coming into real life contact with Big Swiss and their relationship unfolding from there. And although that is the premise of the book, there's so much more to it, and I definitely think it's a book that you just need to experience. It is one of those like darkly funny romps that is full of ridiculous things happening, but is so full of heart. And I think, like Cleopatra and Frankenstein, the representation of mental illness in this book was just so incredible. I related so hard to Greta and everything that she was going through, and I loved that she was an older main character and one who wasn't young and just trying to figure her, you know, adult life out. Like, she is a much older woman who is going through the experience of relearning who she is and what she wants out of life. This is both a queer love story, but also an examination of infidelity, mental health, and also sexual stereotypes that we have. And this book, like the other ones on this list, comes with a lot of triggers, so I would search up content warnings, but ultimately I think this book was just so incredible and hit me so deeply in my soul. I was like sobbing by the end. And I think part of that has to do with the way that it deals with the idea of generational trauma, like Cleopatra and Frankenstein did as well. But this idea that people who grow up with parents who have severe mental illness find themselves in these situations where they are repeating the behaviors of their parents and generations before them. It is very hard to break the cycle of generational trauma, and I think the way this book represented Greta and her whole evolutionary process was just so incredible. I know some people who read this book will not see those aspects, but I think I personally did, and I just love this book so much for that. So with all that said and all of those sentimental feelings aside, those were my top 10 books of the 2023. This year was so different from previous years of my life, both in my personal life but also in my reading and the books that I was picking up. I picked up so many memoirs this year, and it is obviously reflected in my top 10 list for this year. And I think despite all of the challenges that I faced this year, I wouldn't have changed a second of it because I've learned so much about myself and about my taste in books. And I'm just so glad that I am here, that I've made it to this point, and that all of you are here along for the journey with me. Thank you all so much for sticking with me through this very hard year, through the inconsistent content, and through all of the, you know, promises that I've made and, you know, failed to keep. I appreciate all of you for your support and everything that you do here, and the way that you make me feel treasured and important and like I have something to say. So from deep within my heart, thank you guys so much. I love you all immensely. I hope you are all having a wonderful end to your year, and that you are giving yourself grace and remembering that you made it, and that there's someone out here who cares and appreciates you immensely. So thank you guys so much. Let me know down below what you thought of my favorites list for this year, if any of these are your favorites, and let me know what your top 10 books are for 2023. Leave those rankings down below, and I will see you guys in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!